She held me, and for a moment, the world simply stopped. It's emotional, mysterious, and instantly draws viewers into the slow burn tension. The first time he saw her wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling in the background or moment of cinematic revelation. It was quieter, subtler, but infinitely more magnetic. She was standing by the window of the small bookshop, sunlight catching the soft lines of her face, and the warmth in her eyes seemed to reach him even across the room. She moved with an effortless grace, a quiet confidence that wasn't demanding attention but naturally drew it. Her hands adjusted a scarf around her neck, the fabric brushing lightly against her cheek, and he found himself noticing the small details. The curve of her wrist, the slight tilt of her chin, the way her hair caught the light in strands of chestnut and gold. He lingered near the shelves, pretending to browse, but his mind traced every movement she made. There was something in the way she hummed softly to herself while flipping through a book, a rhythm so natural it felt like an unspoken language, a cadence only he could hear. His heart thumped in quiet awareness, not the nervous rush of panic, but a steady pull of curiosity and something he couldn't quite name. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that he was paying attention in a way he never did with anyone else. When she glanced up and caught his eyes, there was a flicker of recognition, a polite, fleeting smile, and yet it was enough to make him feel as if the world had paused for a breath. His hand brushed against the spine of a book he wasn't even interested in, and he felt a shiver run up his arm, a small, electric acknowledgement that something was beginning here, though neither of them yet knew what. In those moments, he became acutely aware of contrasts. Her calm, assured presence against his own restless energy, the quiet steadiness of her gaze compared to the flurry of thoughts running through his mind. He wondered, fleetingly, about the life she had led. How many joys, regrets, and secrets were tucked behind that serene expression. There was an age in her eyes, a depth he hadn't yet experienced, and it made him feel both intimidated and fascinated all at once. As she turned to leave, he noticed the faint scent of her perfume, warm, floral, and comforting, like sunlight through an open window. It lingered in the air long after she was gone, leaving him aware of an emptiness, a quiet ache that he didn't quite understand. He wanted to follow, to say something meaningful, but the words lodged in his throat, tangled with the weight of respect and hesitation. The space between them stretched, measured not in feet, but in a fragile awareness of possibility. And yet, something shifted inside him in those fleeting moments. He felt a pull, gentle but insistent, toward a connection that promised warmth and quiet understanding. There was no rush, no dramatic spark, only the soft hum of curiosity, of noticing, and of an unspoken recognition that something important had begun. It was a first glance, a fleeting encounter, and yet it carried the weight of something that could stretch beyond time itself. By the time he walked out of the shop, the echo of her presence lingered like sunlight on his skin. He didn't yet know her name, or if he ever would, but he knew, with a subtle certainty that surprised him, that this was the start of a story he wanted to be part of, one quiet moment at a time. The days after that first quiet encounter, he found himself searching for reasons to cross paths with her again. The world seemed to conspire in small, unexpected ways. A chance meeting at the park, a shared line at the coffee shop, a quiet smile exchanged over a stack of books. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic. Yet each interaction left him with a lingering warmth, a sense that the universe was gently nudging them closer together. Their first shared moment came in the simplest of forms. He noticed her struggling with a tote bag filled with books, the weight of it pulling her slightly forward as she tried to maintain balance on the narrow sidewalk. Without thinking, he stepped forward, catching the bag just before it tipped over. Their hands brushed lightly as they adjusted their grip, and the contact sent a subtle spark along his arm. Not startling, not shocking, but a quiet jolt of awareness that made his pulse thrum a little faster. Her eyes met his, and she smiled, soft and genuine, a mixture of gratitude and amusement that made his chest feel warmer than it had in weeks. In those moments, touch became a language of its own. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder as they exchanged books. Fingers brushing unintentionally as they reached for the same object. Even the slight proximity on the park bench as they shared a seat. Each gesture was unspoken, yet brimming with meaning. He noticed how her presence seemed to slow time itself. The subtle scent of her perfume, a soft floral with hints of warmth, lingered just enough to leave him caught in a reverie long after she'd gone. The conversations were slow, deliberate, and intimate, even when they were about the smallest things. A recommendation for a novel. A shared joke over an oddly shaped coffee cup. A passing comment about the weather that stretched into a discussion of favorite childhood memories. In her company, he felt an ease he hadn't expected. He could be silent without discomfort, and when they spoke, their words carried weight. Each glance, each laugh, each pause seemed to deepen the quiet intimacy between them. He began noticing details he might have overlooked before. The way her hands moved when she spoke, graceful and intentional. The way her eyes softened when she laughed. The slight curve of her lips when she was concentrating. These are not overtly romantic signals, but to him, they were magnetic, pulling him in with a subtle insistence. There was a rhythm to their interactions, a quiet cadence of connection that was intoxicating in its simplicity. Even in silence, there was communication. Sitting together on a park bench, the sun low in the sky, he felt the gentle pressure of her hand resting near his on the wooden seat. It was casual, natural, yet it carried a weight of unspoken understanding, a promise of trust, of warmth, of something unspoken that neither of them needed to name yet. By the time they parted that evening, he felt a quiet ache of anticipation for the next encounter. There was no rush, no desperate longing, just a subtle, persistent pull that drew him toward her again and again. Each shared moment, no matter how small, was a brushstroke painting the beginnings of a connection that promised to be as gentle as it was profound. In these quiet, shared moments, he realized something important. Connection wasn't always born from grand gestures. Sometimes it began in the smallest interactions, in laughter, in touches, in the silent acknowledgement of each other's presence. And from those, something lasting could grow. By now, their encounters had settled into a comfortable rhythm, yet there was a new undercurrent he couldn't ignore. It wasn't anything, she said. In fact, her words were always measured, gentle, and grounded. It was the way her gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, the subtle tilt of her head when she listened to him, the soft laugh that seemed to echo in his chest long after it faded. Every interaction carried a quiet electricity, one that he felt more in his own skin than in anything external. The first moment he truly noticed the tension came one late afternoon at the small cafe they had both begun frequenting. She sat at the corner table, a book open before her, sunlight spilling across her hair in warm streaks of amber and gold. As he approached, the air between them seemed to shift imperceptibly. Their hands brushed as he reached for his chair, a contact so fleeting it might have been imagined. And yet, he felt the lingering heat along his arm, a warmth that wasn't there moments before. Sitting across from her, he became painfully aware of the space between them. Not just physical, but emotional, a delicate boundary neither wanted to cross too soon. He watched the subtle expressions that passed across her face, the brief quirk of her brow, the hesitant bite of her lower lip, the way her eyes would flick to his and then quickly away. It was tantalizing, frustrating, and intoxicating all at once. He wanted to reach across, to bridge the distance with a gentle hand or a reassuring touch, yet something in her demeanor told him patience was necessary. Even in silence, there was communication. A shared glance at a passing dog, the brush of knees under the table, a soft exhale when she leaned back in her chair, closer than she might have intended. Each moment felt weighted, charged, and he noticed it in the way his pulse quickened and his thoughts scattered. He caught himself rehearsing what he might say, how he might lean in just enough to close the distance without overstepping, but the words always dissolved into quiet observation. The tension was mutual. She seemed aware of it, too. Her fingers lingered on the edge of her cup a moment too long. Her eyes met his in fleeting acknowledgement, then darted away. When she laughed, it was quieter than usual, softer, almost shy, and he felt a deep, unspoken connection in that restraint. The age difference, subtle as it was, hovered in his mind. He wondered if she felt it too, or if the hesitation came from a more personal, unspoken place. Even everyday movements took on new significance. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the subtle shifting of her posture when he spoke, the soft warmth of her presence as she leaned slightly closer across the table. Every small action became a language, every glance a message of curiosity, restraint, and quiet desire. By the end of that afternoon, he left the cafe with a strange mix of exhilaration and longing. Their connection was undeniable, yet the tension hung like a fine thread, delicate and potent, waiting to be drawn closer or to fray entirely. He realized at this stage of their relationship, this subtle, almost invisible push and pull was as intoxicating as any moment of closeness. It was the slow burn, the unspoken desire, the quiet awareness of each other's presence that made the ordinary extraordinary. And in that lingering tension, he felt the first true ache of longing, the awareness that their story was no longer just a series of shared moments, but a quietly building, impossible-to-ignore attraction, one that demanded patience, attention, and care. Up until now, their interactions had danced along the edges of familiarity and curiosity, a delicate balancing act between comfort and restraint. But one evening, in the soft glow of late afternoon, the rhythm shifted. The world seemed to recede around them as they sat together on the park bench, autumn leaves drifting lazily in the breeze. The air was crisp but not cold, and he noticed how her scarf moved gently with the wind, brushing lightly against her cheek. There was something in the simplicity of the moment that made the usual barriers feel less necessary. She began to speak quietly, almost hesitantly, sharing fragments of her past, a story of love lost long ago, of dreams she had pursued and abandoned, of moments that had shaped her in ways both subtle and profound. He listened, caught in the cadence of her words, aware of the occasional tremor in her voice, the soft catch in her breath, the way her hands rested vulnerably in her lap. He felt the weight of trust in that small space. She was revealing herself without fanfare, allowing him a glimpse behind the carefully composed exterior he had admired from afar. For his part, he shared small pieces of his own story, the disappointments and doubts, the uncertainties that he rarely voiced to anyone else. Each revelation was tentative, careful, as if testing the waters of her understanding. And she met it with quiet attentiveness, her eyes softening with empathy, her hand brushing lightly against his forearm in a gesture that was both grounding and intimate. The contact was fleeting, almost casual, yet it carried a resonance that neither of them could ignore. He felt the pulse of her warmth through the thin fabric of her sleeve, and with it, the subtle acknowledgement of mutual recognition and care. In that moment, physical closeness became an extension of emotional intimacy. When she reached out to adjust a loose strand of his hair brushing his forehead, her fingers lingered slightly longer than necessary, and he felt a shiver of awareness run along his spine. It was not a romantic overture in the overt sense, but it was charged with meaning, a small, steady act of connection that bridged the unspoken distance between them. He realized that the restraint that had defined their interactions until now was giving way to a gentle, mutual desire for closeness, tempered by respect and understanding. The tension of the unspoken age difference lingered, but no longer felt like a barrier. Instead, it added depth to the trust forming between them. She seemed aware of it too, her quiet smiles and subtle gestures carrying reassurance that she valued this space they were building together. Each glance, each breath, each fleeting touch became a language in itself, a conversation of trust, vulnerability, and restrained affection that words alone could not capture. By the time the sun had dipped behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of amber and rose. He felt a profound shift. The quiet moments of shared vulnerability had transformed the dynamic between them. He no longer simply admired her from a distance. He felt a part of her story, intertwined in a way that was both exhilarating and grounding. And she, in turn, seemed to lean ever so slightly into his presence, trusting him with pieces of herself she had rarely shown anyone. It was in these shared confessions, these soft, tentative gestures of understanding and care, that the true intimacy of their connection began to take root. They were no longer just two people brushing against each other in passing. They were becoming a safe harbor for one another, a space where vulnerability was welcomed, acknowledged, and held with quiet reverence. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of moment you see in movies with swelling music or cinematic lighting. It was quiet. It was deliberate. And yet, it carried a weight that made his chest feel impossibly full. They had spent weeks navigating the delicate rhythm of closeness, teasing the boundaries of familiarity and restraint, and now, for the first time, those boundaries seemed to blur. They were walking along a quiet cobblestone path after an afternoon spent in the small art gallery they both loved. The air was tinged with the scent of rain from an earlier drizzle, earthy and clean. His jacket brushed lightly against hers as they walked, shoulders nearly touching. For a moment, their hands brushed accidentally, and neither pulled away. He could feel the warmth of her hand against his, the subtle pressure of her fingertips lingering just enough to make him acutely aware of the space between them, and how fragile, yet magnetic, that space could be. The moment came when they paused to look at a painting, abstract, with bold swaths of color that somehow seemed to mirror the tension between them. She leaned slightly toward him, as if to share a thought, and their proximity became an unspoken invitation. He turned toward her, and without thinking, he reached out. Her arms slipped around his waist with an ease that felt both natural and profound, her cheek resting lightly against his chest. He felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, slow and rhythmic beneath his ear, a grounding force that seemed to still the world around them. Time, at that moment, felt like it had stopped. The noises of the city faded, the distant hum of cars and chatter dissolved into nothing, and there was only this, the warmth of her embrace, the subtle scent of her hair brushing against his face, the soft weight of her head against him. It wasn't just physical closeness, it was an emotional tether, a declaration without words. He could feel the trust she placed in him, the openness she allowed, and the unspoken understanding that this connection was rare, delicate, and profound. His hands rested lightly on her back, tracing a comforting line as if to communicate the same thing she had already said without words, that he was here, that he noticed, that he cared. Her fingers curved slightly against the fabric of his jacket, the motion unconscious, yet brimming with intent. Every subtle movement, every soft sigh was a dialogue of affection, restraint, and longing that neither of them needed to verbalize. He became aware of the contours of her presence, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the warmth radiating through her arms, the quiet solidity of her form pressed against his. It was intimate without being explicit, tender without being fragile, and it left him with a profound sense of awe. She trusted him. She chose him in this quiet, suspended moment. And when they eventually stepped back, a mutual reluctance lingered in the air. Their eyes met, soft smiles exchanging acknowledgement of what had just passed, a connection so deep that it had shifted something fundamental within both of them. He felt a quiet thrill, a sense of wonder, and an unspoken promise that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly seen, not just noticed, not just admired, but recognized, held, and cherished in a way that made time itself feel insignificant. For a while, it felt as though the world had conspired in their favor. Their connection had been quiet, steady, and increasingly profound. But now, subtle cracks began to appear, not between them directly, but in the invisible walls of hesitation, expectation, and fear that had always lingered just beneath the surface. It started with whispers and casual conversations, remarks meant lightly but weighted with judgment. A friend mentioned the difference in their ages with a teasing tone that felt far too pointed. He tried to laugh it off, but a small seed of doubt had been planted. Could they really navigate the outside world together? Could she, confident, composed, experienced, truly welcome someone so much younger into her life without hesitation? And could he, so deeply drawn to her, bear the quiet scrutiny that seemed inevitable in such a relationship? The tension became palpable in their interactions. He found himself pulling back slightly, analyzing each touch, each glance, each word before he responded. He noticed her too, the way her smile sometimes faltered when she sensed his hesitation, the slight pause before she reached out as if measuring the right moment. Even when they were physically near, the air was charged with an almost invisible friction, the push and pull of desire tempered by uncertainty. One afternoon, as they sat together in the quiet corner of a bookstore, the conflict became impossible to ignore. He reached to brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek, an instinctive gesture, and for the first time, she hesitated before leaning into it. The simple act, usually effortless and tender, now carried the weight of unspoken questions. Was he overstepping? Did she feel the same pull he did, or was she holding herself back for reasons he could only guess at? Their eyes met, soft yet searching, each waiting for a signal the other was not yet ready to give. He felt the ache of longing mixed with caution. Every instinct urged him to close the distance, to bridge the hesitation with touch, with words, with presence. Yet, the fear of misunderstanding, of overstepping, or being judged by the world outside held him back. He became acutely aware of every nuance of her body language, the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the careful positioning of her hands, the micro-expressions that hinted at her internal conflict. Each of these small signs became a conversation in itself, a delicate dance of emotional negotiation. Even simple moments, walking side by side through a quiet park, sharing a bench, or exchanging a book, became exercises in restraint and attentiveness. A hand that lingered too long or a brush of fingers could carry the weight of tension that neither wanted to verbalize. And yet, beneath all this hesitation, the desire for closeness remained, simmering just beneath the surface, quietly demanding acknowledgement. By evening, as they parted ways under the amber glow of streetlights, the tension had not fully dissipated. The hesitation lingered like a soft echo, a reminder that the slow burn of their connection was not without challenges. But despite the doubts and the external pressures, there was also a quiet resilience in the bond they shared, a mutual recognition that what they felt for each other was worth navigating, worth waiting for, and worth protecting against the subtle forces that threatened to pull them apart. The ache of longing and the weight of hesitation coexisted in a delicate balance, leaving him both unsettled and profoundly aware of how deeply he had come to care. It was in this fragile tension that the story of their bond grew more real, more human, and more compelling than ever before. After weeks of quiet longing, hesitation, and subtle tension, the moment finally arrived when everything between them felt balanced, complete, and undeniably real. It wasn't a grand declaration or a sudden, dramatic gesture. It was the culmination of small, meaningful acts, shared glances, and moments of trust that had built a bridge strong enough to hold them both. It was a cool, late afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky and paints everything in shades of gold and amber. They had walked together along a familiar street, their steps synchronized in comfortable rhythm, and paused beneath the branches of an old tree whose leaves rustled gently in the breeze. The quiet was heavy with anticipation, but not with fear. The tension that had existed in their connection had softened into something tender, warm, and steady. She turned toward him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in the way she moved. Her eyes held an openness, a quiet certainty that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached out, Her arms slipped around his waist with a gentle ease, her cheek resting softly against his chest. He could feel her warmth, steady and grounding, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Time itself seemed suspended, measured only by the quiet rise and fall of their breathing, the subtle press of her body against his, and the soft rhythm of her heartbeat beneath his ear. He responded instinctively, sliding his hands along her back, feeling the subtle contours of her form and the comforting weight of her presence. Their closeness wasn't passionate or hurried. It was patient, deliberate, and entirely mutual. Every soft sigh, every lingering glance, every delicate brush of fingertips spoke volumes that words could never capture. In that embrace, he felt seen in a way he had never experienced before, recognized, understood, and cherished. The emotional intimacy they had built over weeks of quiet moments, shared laughter, and tentative touches now blossomed fully. He noticed the small details he had always loved. The way her hair fell across her shoulders, the subtle tilt of her chin, the softness in her eyes that had always drawn him in. She, in turn, seemed to lean ever so slightly into his presence, an unspoken affirmation that their connection was real, grounded, and safe. They lingered there, neither wanting to break the moment, both acutely aware that this closeness was a rare and precious gift. Every subtle motion, the gentle squeeze of her hand, the reassuring press of her back against his, reinforced the bond they had nurtured. It was an intimacy that went beyond physical proximity. It was emotional, spiritual, and profoundly human. When they finally stepped back, a mutual smile passed between them, quiet, warm, and unhurried. There were no words necessary. Everything that needed to be said had been communicated in the pauses, the touches, and the steady closeness they had shared. He felt an overwhelming sense of contentment, of being exactly where he belonged. She, too, carried the same calm certainty, a reflection of trust and affection that had grown naturally, deeply, and without rush. As they walked together into the soft glow of evening, the world felt lighter, slower, and infinitely more beautiful. The challenges, the hesitation, the unspoken tensions, all of it had been worth it. They had found each other in the quiet moments, the lingering touches, and the patient unfolding of emotion. In the end, the slow burn had blossomed into a warmth that was enduring, safe, and deeply, undeniably real. In that shared space, beneath the fading light, he realized something profound. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it holds quietly, patiently, until time itself feels as though it has stopped, and in that stillness, everything finally falls into place.